learning over the last 50 or so years. The Kyoto Accord is another example of a functionally specific form of global governance struck in 1997, which argued, or which mandated, that we would reduce collectively greenhouse gas emissions, or GHGs, by over 5% by 2012. These are functionally specific forms of global governance. The fourth feature of global governance is that we presume that it's participatory. One of the real innovations of modern global governance is that it really is about global participation. In the past, international agreements tended to be agreements among great powers. In the 19th century, when you had international agreements, it was basically European powers. The Treaty of Versailles, for instance, was a great power treaty, which excluded at the time Japan. What we now have in terms of global governance is truly participatory and global participatory mechanisms by which decisions are reached. A system in which then all states are stakeholders, and all states are presumed to be deliberators and contributors to the making of international governance rules. As I've already suggested, for instance, in the United Nations, all states are equal. They all have the equal vote in the UN General Assembly, regardless of how powerful your country might be. The fifth feature of global governance is what we might call enlightened sovereignty. As our very own Prime Minister Stephen Harper said on the G20, we must come together in a spirit less about narrow self-interested sovereignty's name than an expanded view of mutual interest in which there is room for all to grow and prosper. Enlightened sovereignty, then, is the natural extension of enlightened self-interest. In many ways, what Harper is talking about here is the embodiment of the post-war Keynesian compromise and the notion of embedded liberalism. That yes, national self-interests are important, that we live in a sovereign world in which national self-interests have to be respected, but that in the era of global governance, that collective interests, or enlightened sovereignty as he called it, should in many ways trump very strict and narrow definitions of national interest. That we live in a collective, interdependent world. In fact, actually tomorrow, if you care, we will have the former Chinese ambassador to Canada visiting the Asian Institute, and we have a student-only seminar with him to talk about these very issues. There are still 10 spots. If you're interested, you can email me. There are only 10 spots left, but it's only for students in which you can talk to this former ambassador. And one of the key issues that we want to press him on, of course, is this idea of enlightened sovereignty. So if you're interested, just send me an email. The sixth characteristic of global governance is coordination. That this isn't simply the imposition of rules and laws by a hegemonic power, but rather through the processes of participatory deliberation, if we go back to the first slide, through the idea of enlightened sovereignty, that all states will deliberate and form a form of coordination across interstate policy making. That these processes of coordination are transparent, that they're iterated, that they take place over time, and in many ways that we can think of global governance as a process, not just simply as a rule book, but rather as a process of change. All of this is to suggest then that global governance and in managing new global risks is about international compromise. It's about creating compromise. In economics, we refer to this as Pareto optimality, basically saying that it may not be the best compromise for you specifically, but it's the best compromise for everyone collectively. that if it was truly a zero-sum game, you wouldn't want to make this compromise. But when we begin to understand it as a positive-sum game, then we begin to understand global governance as a collective fate, then we are acting and behaving in a way that fosters international compromise. So basically, I hope I've made the case to you that global governance is a wonderful thing. It's a fantastic way in which we can resolve global problems. It's a fantastic way in which we can create solutions for new global risks. If you think about it, global governance is really the manifestation of all those lessons that we have learned from the 19th and 20th century. That we don't want to repeat what happened in the interwar period. We don't want to repeat what happened with the rise of Germany. We don't want to repeat, frankly, in the American imposition of a notion of a global order in the post-war period, because that pissed off a lot of people. We've learned from the past, and in so doing, we want to put into practice global governance. But as with all things in politics and indeed in political science, there are serious challenges. Now again, I hope you all leave here thinking that global governance in its abstract form is something we should all be striving for. But I would be remiss and irresponsible if I didn't actually tell you about some of the challenges, some of the things that we need to work out. The first challenge is the collective action problem. The true test, if you think about it, of global governance would be if we could, as an international community of states, come up with long-term solutions for long-term complicated problems. Right? Wouldn't that be fantastic? Isn't that what global governance is supposed to be about? Wouldn't it be, for instance, fantastic if we could adopt those features of global governance and come up with an effective long-term solution for climate change? Isn't that what global governance is all about? Well, let's look at global climate change. There are, in fact, if you think about it, when you read the literature, there are two opposing viewpoints about climate change. The first is forwarded by James Hansen, who was an advisor to Al Gore, so you can imagine what his position will be. For Hansen, you know, smart guy, works for NASA, has all the credentials to make these claims. He is a scientist. And he says the climate is nearing tipping points. If we do not change course, we will hand our children a situation that is out of their control. Now, tipping points, of course, popularized by folks like Malcolm Gladwell, suggest that once you tip over this tipping point, you've gone past the point of no return. And that in terms of climate change and in terms of climate science, which James Hansen, for Dr. Hansen, will be a part of, is arguing that unless we begin to make some fundamental changes, we are going to tip over that tipping point. And we are going to put ourselves in an irreversible position. And hence the illusion that to handing our children a situation that is out of their control. They no longer have any say in their own fate because we will have tipped the scales beyond the tipping point. Freeman Dyson at a not unreputable place called Princeton University argues the climate studies people who work with models always tend to overestimate their models. Science is not a matter of opinion, it is a question of data. Dangers cannot be predicted until we know more about its causes. These are two reputable scientists. We have on the top James Hansen, who would be someone that Freeman Dyson would say is an alarmist. He's blowing things out of proportion. Freeman Dyson is somebody who James Hansen would say is a denier. That he is not looking at the data and he is basically trying to obfuscate and deny. The point is that we have two reputable camps who work in the name of objective science, who are looking at the exact same evidence and who are drawing diametrically opposed conclusions. We have one camp that says we are in the midst of a doomsday scenario. We have another camp that says, well, it's no big deal. Or at least, I don't know for certain if we are in a doomsday scenario. This fundamental discord affects how we approach the global governance of climate change. So, you were all told to bring your clickers. Here's the first clicker question. With respect, in your own opinion, as voters, as educated young people who no doubt care about these issues, with respect to global climate change, in your opinion, have we reached the tipping point or the point of no return? Okay, so 34% of you say yes, we have reached the tipping point. 34% of you say yes, we have reached the tipping point. 47% of you say no, we have not. And 17% of you say you don't know. Interestingly, just for your information, last year 45% said yes, 37% said no, and 18% said, which is virtually the same number, that they didn't know.
What about the 2%?
So the point, well, first of all, what that demonstrates is tremendous uncertainty within our class. But the difference between last year's poll and this year's poll also reinforces this degree of uncertainty across different classes in a relatively short time period. It's important, therefore, then, that we consider climate change as what we call in public policy a wicked problem. And it's precisely these wicked problems that are the ones that we try to solve through global governance. Climate change is a certain kind of policy challenge. Instinctively, as I've already suggested to you, we believe ardently that climate change and environmental policy more generally is something that should be and can be resolved through global governance. It should be because we share a collective faith. It can be because global governance is the only way in which we can get all stakeholders together in the same room to collectively participate in a policy-making process. But one of the fundamental challenges of a wicked problem is this tremendous uncertainty. Notwithstanding the fact that even as a class, or even as a generational cohort, there's no agreement as to whether or not we've reached the tipping point. In other words, Hansen is kind of right, Dyson is kind of right, depending on who you ask, and apparently depending on what year. But there's tremendous uncertainty just in terms of how we understand the climate change problem. We believe, as Dyson would argue, we believe that greenhouse gas emissions contribute to global warming. But he would ask, do we know for certain? Is there irrefutable proof? And if there is irrefutable proof that GHG, or greenhouse gas emissions, does contribute to global warming, do we know for certain how much? How much can we attribute to GHG emissions? Until we actually know this, can we have any basis upon which we can agree with respect to global policy change? And again, I want to stress to you, this may seem absolutely ridiculous to you, but these are the conversations that take place. Smart people on both sides of the debate, bringing together, marshaling, and interpreting evidence to suggest one or the other. So there's tremendous uncertainty in terms of the causality or causal relationship between, for instance, GHG emissions and global climate change. There's also this very sneaky matter of what we call multiple causality. How how much of greenhouse gas, well, how much of global warming, or the effects of global warming, can we attribute to greenhouse gas emissions? Let me put it in very real-world terms for you. One of the big debates together right now, one of the big debates going on right now, for instance, in China, when you talk to people there and you say, you know, your environmental record is atrocious, right? And, you know, this is just, look, and you see pictures of Beijing lately, I mean, this is just bad, right? And then they say to you, yeah, we agree it's bad, but, you know, most of it is actually being caused by foreign firms. Foreign factories operating in China, right? Not Chinese firms operating in China. And then you say, well, how much? They say, well, I don't know. But until we figure out how much, and until we begin to suss out this multiple causal relationship, it's very difficult to find a very difficult basis upon which to make compromise, upon which to make decisions. So when you talk to Chinese policymakers about creating better legislation, they'll say, well, we're not sure which firms are the ones that are actually the polluters. And we're not sure how much that pollution is actually affecting our climate and our environment. That's a real thorny problem, and again, why we call climate change a wicked problem. There's also this thing of intergenerational consequences. Climate change is a real wicked problem for us because we have to balance in many ways the long-term implications of environmental degradation against the short-term, if you will, benefits of environmental degradation. It's not an uncompelling response when someone says to you, yes, we really do need to curb our pollution because that will affect people's lives 1,000 years from now. But we really need jobs today because that's going to affect thousands of people's lives today. Now, as a good moral person, how do you respond to that? Bearing in mind all of the other uncertainties and routes of multiple causality. It's because of these things, uncertainty, multiple causality, and this debate about intergenerational consequences, is such that then we have what are called, as you all know, collective action problems. When you combine uncertainty with the reality of multiple causes and the imperatives of short-term gains versus long-term degradation, you invariably lead to what we call a collective action problem in which people defect, in which countries defect, in which countries or firms do not comply, in which others free ride because somebody else will take care of it or somebody else can be blamed. It goes all the way back to our first semester when we talked about collective action problems. When you see a piece of garbage on the ground, do you invariably pick it up? Most of you said no, because you are rational. That's the collective action problem. You free ride. Somebody else will do it. It's too much of a near-term cost for me to pick that up versus the long-term gain of what will be experienced 1,000 years from now. It's precisely this problem, then, that we see tremendous collective action problems at the global level. And indeed, if you care, the United States has not ratified the Kyoto Accord. Another challenge. Doesn't it make sense to say that global governance only works when it is truly global and when all countries or all stakeholders comply? Right? Global governance only works if everybody plays by the rules. If there is one weak link, then global governance is less effective. In other words, global governance is only as strong as its weakest link. Well, this was exposed in 2003, and I would suggest it was also exposed in the 14th century, but most people today don't care about that, so we'll look at 2003. 2003, of course, was the time in which there was SARS. How many of you were in Toronto at that time when SARS was here? So you remember this. You remember what it was like, the panic. The social weirdness that was entailed. As a person of Chinese descent, I can assure you that while I liked having the entire subway car to myself, it was a little disconcerting at the same time. SARS was the first, as one colleague puts it, the first post-Westphalian pathogen. It wasn't really, but in terms of global proportions, it really was. It really demonstrated to us that when it comes to illness and sickness, borders really don't matter. And it's not because the global community didn't care. It's not because we don't have a very capable World Health Organization in place. It's not because we don't have the most capable scientists, epidemiologists, and policymakers in place. But because we had several weak links. In 1997, the WHO created a new international health regulation. You don't have to write this down, but it was called the Global Public Health Information Network. And that was the predecessor to what would eventually be called the Global Outbreak Alert Response Network, or GOARN. It was through the GOARN that it was discovered, or that SARS was first discovered in China. Most people date it to actually being in Hong Kong when that quite fateful flight was made from Hong Kong over to Toronto. But in fact, the first case, as we now know, was actually discovered in November of 2002. And the Global Outbreak Alert Response Network hears of this. The WHO then, in the spirit of global governance, approaches the Chinese government and says, can you verify this new strain? And the Chinese government, for understandable reasons, denies it and says there is no new strain. It's just simply a common flu. In other words, then, this case went unreported. In January of 2003, the Ministry of Health officially responds to the WHO and says that what is now confirmed as SARS, as we now know, was simply a case or an outbreak of pneumonia. In February of 2003, the WHO and its epidemiologists and collective scientists were finally allowed into China, but not allowed into Guangdong province, which is the southern province in which it is believed that SARS first began to spread. It was because of that, then, now we know, that it spread through to Hong Kong, which is the neighboring city, spreads to Hong Kong through the rest of the world, such that by late February of 2003, there were 305 infections and 7 deaths. And 3 weeks later, 792 infections and 31 deaths. And as you all will remember, in 2003, by April, there was a WHO travel advisory which basically restricted international travel. So that's just a story of how illness knows no borders. But it also demonstrates to us one of the key challenges of global governance, because on the one hand, it demonstrates really the strength of the World Health Organization. The Global Outbreak Alert Response Network, or GORAN, worked. It picked up through its data collection and through the amalgam of all the Centers for Disease Control around the world. It's actually really interesting, it's sort of forensics, right? They pick up all this data and they notice this spike. And so in many ways, the GORN worked. But there was the problem of non-compliance. And in many ways, it was the non-compliance of states that in the end was the weakest link in this global governance system. Sovereignty, therefore, is double-edged. It's double-edged because on the one hand, you need sovereign states to monitor their own country. You need a Center for Disease Control in the United States. You need the Canadian Center for Disease Control in Winnipeg. You need the command center in Hong Kong. You need the command center in Beijing. You need sovereign states to monitor their own countries. Yet on the other hand, it's precisely that sovereignty that allows these states to non-comply. You need them on the one hand to monitor for you, but on the other hand, it's the fact of sovereignty that also leads to non-compliance. And what's more, we can't punish. We don't live in a world of global government. We live in a world, at best, of global governance, where you hope that the notion of collective fate and collective responsibility holds true and that people will comply. This was a real important question in the international system immediately after the outbreak of SARS. Should China, this was talked about in the Congress, should China be punished by the international community for failing to report the initial case of SARS? Just so you know, 2/3 of you, interestingly, this last year's class, 82% said yes, 18% said no. This year we have a more moderate class. Only 2/3 of you believe that China should be punished for having failed to report the initial case of SARS. That's your opinion. The fact of the matter is, in the system of global governance, as it is today, China cannot be punished. And arguably, and many of us would make the argument, should not be punished if we are to take seriously this notion of sovereignty. But again, that's the double edge. We talk about global governance as this wonderful aspirational arrangement in which we all recognize our collective fate, and yet the bottom line is that we live in a world made up of sovereign states. There's another challenge. The key assumption, as we've already talked about, of global governance is that it's a system based on equality. That regardless if you're a powerful country or a poor country, if you're a militarily strong country or a militarily weak country, at least in global governance, you're all equal. That in the UN system of states, in the UN General Assembly, doesn't matter if you're the United States or if you are a bankrupt country, you get one vote. Sovereignty affords that equality. And so therefore then we assume global governance is about global participation. It's not about the great power compromises of the 19th century. It's not about the Treaty of Versailles in the early 20th century. Global governance is fundamentally different because it's about global participation. The reality, however, is if you look, for instance, here, and this is just emblematic of this, is that if you look at the weighted vote in the IBRD, which is the World Bank, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, you can actually see that outside of the United Nations, that other international organizations, such as the World Bank, which is based on country contributions, or the International Monetary Fund, which is based on country contributions, or financial regulatory bodies, which tend to be based in New York City or London, that in fact, there is quite a bit of inequality. That if you look at the weighted vote here in the World Bank, in fact, in many ways, although China is now rising, that in many ways this represents existing inequalities in the international system. In other words, that on the one hand, while we want to believe that global governance is about global participation, it really is in many ways a myth. States are not equal in the distribution of power in many global governance mechanisms. That while we always hold to the UN system of states and the UN General Assembly, whereby every country has one vote, the fact of the matter is that in many international organizations, the distribution of power is far from egalitarian. And in fact, what we oftentimes see are rich countries having a certain set of interests and ideas about how the world should work, versus those ideas propagated by poorer countries. That UN notion of harmonizing national interests across